There's a particular tragedy that Carl Jung observed in his decades of working with women, and it's one that our society has made infinitely worse. It's the tragedy of the woman who has been taught to be perfect, to be pure, to be everything except whole. Jung called this the denial of the shadow, and he warned that when a woman refuses to acknowledge her darkness, she doesn't become more feminine, she becomes a ghost of herself. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a woman standing in front of a mirror, but she can only see half of her reflection. The other half, the angry, the jealous, the ambitious, the sexual, the fierce, has been painted over with white paint. She's been told this is what makes her beautiful. This is what makes her worthy of love. But Jung knew something our culture refuses to admit. A woman who cannot see her whole self will never truly know her power. You know that feeling, right? That moment when you catch yourself being too much and immediately dial it down. When your voice gets smaller, your opinion softer, your presence less threatening. That's not femininity, that's self-amputation. And Jung warned that this kind of psychological surgery comes with a price that most women don't realize they're paying until it's almost too late. The feminine shadow isn't some dark, evil force lurking in the basement of the psyche. It's the repository of everything a woman has been told she cannot be. It's her anger at injustice, her fierce protectiveness, her sexual desires, her competitive spirit, her need for independence, her moments of selfishness, her capacity for destruction when something threatens what she loves. These aren't character flaws, they're the other half of her completeness. But here's what happens when a woman is taught to exile these parts of herself. Picture a river that's been dammed up. All that water doesn't just disappear. It finds other ways to flow, and often those ways are destructive. The woman who cannot access her anger becomes passive-aggressive. The woman who cannot acknowledge her sexuality becomes manipulative. The woman who cannot own her ambition becomes resentful. The woman who cannot embrace her capacity for selfishness becomes a martyr who suffocates everyone around her with her sacrifice. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Women would come to him feeling empty, exhausted, like they were living someone else's life. They described feeling like they were performing femininity rather than embodying it. They talk about a persistent sense that something was missing, but they couldn't name what it was. What was missing was themselves, the whole, complete, unedited versions of themselves. This is like watching someone try to walk with one leg tied behind their back and calling it grace. The woman who denies her shadow doesn't become more spiritual or more pure, she becomes incomplete. And incompleteness, Jung warned, is not a virtue. It's a wound. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt truly, completely yourself? Not the version of yourself that's been edited for public consumption, not the version that's been sanitized for social media, not the version that's been compressed into someone else's definition of what a woman should be. When was the last time you felt the full spectrum of your being, the light and the dark, the gentle and the fierce, the nurturing and the destructive? The shadow work Jung prescribed for women isn't about becoming more masculine or more aggressive. It's about becoming more complete. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that have been exiled, not to become those things exclusively, but to have access to them when they're needed. It's about understanding that your anger might be the guardian of your boundaries, that your jealousy might be pointing toward what you truly want, that your selfishness might be the voice of your authentic needs. Think about the fairy tales we tell little girls. They're all about being saved, about being chosen, about being good enough to earn love. But what about the stories we don't tell? What about the woman who saves herself? What about the woman who chooses rather than being chosen? What about the woman who is powerful enough to be both feared and loved? Jung worked with women who had been taught that their worth was tied to their ability to disappear, to take up less space, to want less, to need less, to be less. He watched them shrink themselves into shapes that could fit through the narrow doorways of social approval, and he saw how this self-diminishment didn't make them more lovable, it made them invisible, even to themselves. The woman who ignores her shadow becomes what Jung called the eternal child, forever seeking approval, forever afraid of her own power, forever waiting for someone else to give her permission to exist fully. She becomes addicted to being seen as good, as pure, as unthreatening. But this addiction comes at the cost of her authenticity, her depth, her capacity for real intimacy. You see, when you're hiding parts of yourself, you can never truly be known. And if you can never truly be known, you can never truly be loved. The love you receive is for the mask you wear, not for the woman you are. This creates a terrible loneliness, the loneliness of being loved for who you're pretending to be rather than who you actually are. Jung noticed that women who denied their shadow often attracted partners who would act it out for them. The overly sweet woman who attracts the angry man. The submissive woman who attracts the dominating partner. The woman who cannot own her sexuality, attracting the one who objectifies her. This isn't coincidence, it's psychology. We attract what we refuse to integrate. This is like having a conversation with only half your vocabulary. You might be understood, but you'll never be truly heard. The woman who has access to her full range of emotions, including the uncomfortable ones, speaks a language that resonates with truth. She doesn't need to manipulate or perform because she has the full spectrum of human experience at her disposal. But let's be clear about what shadow work isn't. It's not about becoming cruel or selfish or destructive. It's about having access to these energies when they serve you. It's about being able to say no with conviction, to protect what matters to you, to pursue what you want without apology. It's about being able to feel your anger and let it guide you toward your boundaries rather than swallowing it until it becomes resentment. The woman who has integrated her shadow doesn't become less feminine. She becomes more authentically feminine. She's no longer performing femininity. She's embodying it. She's no longer afraid of her own power because she understands it. She's no longer seeking approval because she's learned to approve of herself. Let me tell you about the moment Jung described as the turning point for many of his female patients. It was the moment they stopped asking, "What do others want from me?" and started asking, "What do I want?" This shift from external validation to internal knowing is what he called the birth of the individual. But it requires courage because it means accepting that you might disappoint people, that you might be misunderstood, that you might be called selfish or difficult or too much. You know that voice in your head that whispers, "Good girls don't." That's not your moral compass, that's your shadow prison guard. Good girls don't get angry. Good girls don't want too much. Good girls don't take up space. good girls don't have needs. Good girls don't say no. Good girls don't prioritize themselves. But Jung would ask, what happens to the woman who spends her life trying to be good instead of trying to be whole? The answer is that she becomes a stranger to herself. She becomes someone who can nurture others, but not herself, who can fight for others, but not for herself, who can see the potential in others, but not in herself. She becomes a giver who doesn't know how to receive, a supporter who doesn't know how to ask for support, a woman who lights herself on fire to keep others warm. This is what Jung meant when he said that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For women, this acceptance means embracing the parts of themselves that have been labeled as unacceptable. It means owning their anger, their ambition, their sexuality, their selfishness, their capacity for destruction. Not to become these things, but to have access to them. Think about it like this. Imagine you're a painter who's been told you can only use pastels. You might create beautiful, soft, pleasing pictures, but you'll never create anything with real depth or contrast. The woman who denies her shadow is painting her life with half a palette. She might be pleasant to look at, but she'll never be truly compelling. Jung observed that women who do this shadow work often go through a period that looks like falling apart. They might become more confrontational, more direct, more willing to displease others. Their relationships might shift as they stop being who others want them to be and start being who they actually are. This isn't destruction, it's reconstruction. It's the necessary chaos that comes before authentic order. The woman who integrates her shadow doesn't become harder. She becomes more real. She doesn't become less loving. She becomes more discriminating about where she places her love. She doesn't become less feminine. She becomes more fully herself. And there's nothing more attractive than a woman who is completely, unapologetically herself. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you weren't afraid of being judged? What would you say if you weren't afraid of being called selfish? What would you want if you weren't afraid of wanting too much? These questions point toward your shadow, not the evil parts of you, but the exiled parts, the parts that have been declared inadmissible by a culture that prefers women to be half present. Jung warned that the woman who refuses to meet her shadow will spend her life in a kind of spiritual emergency room, constantly trying to fix problems that stem from her own incompleteness. She'll be exhausted from trying to be good instead of being whole. She'll be resentful from giving more than she receives. She'll be lonely from hiding more than she reveals. But there's hope in Jung's message, and it's this: it's never too late to reclaim yourself. The shadow doesn't disappear with age. It gets stronger, more insistent, more demanding of attention. The woman who does this work at 40 reclaims decades of power she didn't know she had. The woman who does this work at 60 discovers that she's been living as a fraction of herself. The integration of the shadow isn't a one-time event. It's a lifelong practice. It's about noticing when you're shrinking yourself, when you're performing instead of being, when you're seeking approval instead of expressing truth. It's about asking yourself in each moment, am I being who I am, or am I being who I think I should be? This is like learning to breathe with your whole lungs instead of just the top half. At first, it might feel strange, even uncomfortable. But eventually, you realize you've been suffocating yourself all along. The woman who breathes with her whole psyche light and dark, gentle and fierce, giving and receiving, is the woman who truly lives. Jung believed that the work of individuation, becoming who you truly are, was the most important work a person could do. For women, this work is often complicated by centuries of conditioning that tells them their worth lies in their ability to serve others, to be pleasing, to be small. But Jung would say that a woman who sacrifices her wholeness for the comfort of others is not being noble, she's being negligent. She's neglecting her responsibility to become herself. The shadow contains not just what we've been taught to reject, but what we've been taught to fear. For many women, this includes their own power, the power to say no, to leave, to choose, to demand, to expect, to want. These aren't masculine traits, they're human traits that women have been taught to suppress in the name of femininity. You know that feeling when you're in a conversation and you have something important to say, but you hesitate because you're worried about how it will be received? That hesitation is your shadow trying to speak through you. That important thing you want to say, that's not your ego talking. That's your authentic self trying to emerge. The woman who learns to honor these moments, who learns to speak even when her voice shakes, is the woman who begins to reclaim her power. Jung observed that women who do this work often experience what he called the return of the goddess. Not in a religious sense, but in a psychological sense. They begin to embody the full spectrum of feminine power, the creative and the destructive, the nurturing and the fierce, the gentle and the strong. They become women who can comfort and confront, who can give and receive, who can be soft and firm. This transformation isn't always comfortable for the people around them. Family members might complain that she's changed, that she's become selfish or difficult. Friends might feel threatened by her newfound authenticity. Partners might struggle with her increased boundaries and decreased people-pleasing. But Jung would say that these reactions are actually confirmation that the work is working. The woman who integrates her shadow stops being a people-pleaser and starts being a truth-teller. She stops being a martyr and starts being a warrior, not a warrior against others, but a warrior for her own authentic existence. She fights for her right to be whole, to be complex, to be human. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. It looks like the woman who can feel her anger and use it as information about her boundaries. It looks like the woman who can acknowledge her jealousy and use it as a compass pointing toward what she truly wants. It looks like the woman who can own her ambition and pursue her goals without apology. It looks like the woman who can embrace her sexuality and express it on her own terms. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces in creative tension. The woman who can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and connected, both giving and receiving, both light and dark. She's not trying to be perfect, she's trying to be complete. The woman who ignores her shadow lives in a kind of psychological prison where she's both the prisoner and the guard. She's locked herself away from half of her own experience, and she's constantly monitoring herself to make sure she doesn't step out of line. But the woman who embraces her shadow discovers that what she thought was darkness was actually just depth. Jung warned that the collective shadow of women, all the rage, ambition, sexuality, and power that has been suppressed for generations, is beginning to emerge. We're seeing this in the cultural movements around women's rights, in the conversations about consent and autonomy, in the growing refusal to be polite at the expense of authenticity. This isn't women becoming more masculine, it's women becoming more complete. You see, the shadow isn't the enemy of the light, it's the partner of the light. Together, they create the full spectrum of human experience. The woman who can access both her capacity for compassion and her capacity for righteous anger, both her ability to nurture and her ability to destroy what no longer serves her, both her gentleness and her fierceness. This is the woman who is truly free. But freedom comes with responsibility. The woman who reclaims her shadow must learn to use it wisely. She must learn the difference between destructive anger and protective anger, between healthy selfishness and toxic narcissism, between authentic power and manipulative control. This requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel difficult emotions without acting them out destructively. The journey of shadow integration for women often involves grieving the years spent trying to be perfect instead of being real, grieving the relationships that were based on performance rather than authenticity, grieving the dreams that were abandoned in favor of others' expectations. This grief is necessary and holy. It's the price of becoming whole. Jung believed that the woman who does this work doesn't just heal herself, she helps heal the collective wound of feminine suppression. She becomes a permission slip for other women to be whole, to be complex, to be human. She becomes proof that it's possible to be both fierce and loving, both strong and vulnerable, both independent and connected. Let me ask you this. What would it feel like to wake up tomorrow and not have to edit yourself? What would it feel like to speak your truth without calculating how it will be received? What would it feel like to want what you want without shame? What would it feel like to be angry when you're angry? To be sexual when you're sexual? To be ambitious when you're ambitious? That feeling you just imagined, that's not fantasy. That's possibility. That's what Jung called the realization of the self. The moment when you stop being who you think you should be and start being who you actually are. It's the moment when you stop performing femininity and start embodying it. It's the moment when you stop seeking approval and start seeking truth. The woman who integrates her shadow doesn't become perfect. She becomes authentic. She doesn't become invulnerable. She becomes real. She doesn't become easier to love. She becomes more worthy of love. Because finally, for the first time perhaps in her life, she's offering the world her actual self instead of a carefully curated version. This is what Jung meant when he said that the goal of human development is not to become a saint, but to become an individual. The woman who embraces her shadow is not trying to be good. She's trying to be whole. She's not trying to be perfect. She's trying to be real. She's not trying to be approved of. She's trying to be herself. And here's the beautiful paradox that Jung observed. The woman who stops trying to be perfect becomes more beautiful. The woman who stops trying to be good becomes more attractive. The woman who stops trying to please everyone becomes more magnetic. Why? Because authenticity is inherently attractive. Truth is inherently compelling. Wholeness is inherently powerful. The shadow work Jung prescribed for women isn't about becoming more like men. It's about becoming more like themselves. It's about reclaiming the parts of the feminine that have been exiled, the parts that are fierce and protective and powerful. It's about understanding that a woman can be both gentle and strong, both nurturing and independent, both loving and fierce. You've been taught to fear your own power, to apologize for your presence, to make yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. But Jung would tell you that this is not service, it's self-betrayal. The world doesn't need more women who are half-present. The world needs women who are courageously, authentically, completely themselves. The shadow isn't something to be conquered or eliminated, it's something to be integrated. It's not the enemy of your light, it's the partner of your light. Together, they create the full spectrum of your humanity. The woman who can access both her capacity for creation and her capacity for destruction, both her ability to build and her ability to tear down what no longer serves, both her gentleness and her strength, this is the woman who is truly alive. Jung's warning about women who ignore their shadow isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to liberate you. It's meant to give you permission to be whole, to be complex, to be human. It's meant to remind you that you are not here to be perfect. You are here to be real. You are not here to be good. You are here to be authentic. You are not here to be approved of. You are here to be yourself. The woman who does this work, who faces her shadow and integrates it, becomes what Jung called the individuated woman. She's no longer driven by the need for approval or the fear of rejection. She's driven by the need for authenticity and the fear of self-betrayal. She's no longer asking, "What do others want from me?" She's asking, "What do I want from myself?" This is the woman who can love without losing herself, who can give without depleting herself, who can be strong without being hard, who can be soft without being weak. This is the woman who has learned that her wholeness is not a luxury, it's a necessity, not just for her, but for everyone who loves her, everyone who depends on her, everyone who is watching her example. You've always been the one you've been waiting for. Not the perfect version of yourself, not the version that pleases everyone, not the version that never makes mistakes, the whole version, the real version, the version that includes your light and your shadow, your strengths and your flaws, your capacity for love and your capacity for anger. That woman, the complete woman, has been waiting for you to acknowledge her, to embrace her, to become her. Now finally, you can see her. Now finally, you can be her.